Thanks for the comprehensive introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Very happy to be here. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about how we can really formally define security in the context of Bitcoin. What are some of the attacks that we can apply? What are some of the countermeasures? Of course, I cannot go through all the attacks, but I try my best to at least refer to a couple of most interesting ones. And I believe that it's the best that if you have any question in the middle of the presentation, just feel free to interrupt me and go ahead if it was not clear or anything else. So I start with a very general background on the classical consensus mechanisms. Since 1970s, when the distributed systems start to emerge, the researchers start to work on a couple of protocols to design a better or secure distributed systems, and one of those protocols are the consensus mechanisms. These consensus mechanisms have been studied under different namings. So here I will start with the most basic one, which is the agreement protocol. So in the agreement protocol, we have a set of distributed parties or nodes. These nodes can be honest and active, which means that they are completely following the behavior of the protocol, and they are active. So they are online and they are actively participating in the protocols. Some of these nodes can be offline, so they are honest, but at this moment, they don't have access to the network. Or they can also be adversarial, meaning that they are doing their best to alter the result of the consensus, so they can deviate from the honest strategy. So in the agreement protocol, each player starts with an input. This input is 0 or 1. For example, you can consider 0 as whether you agree with a specific transaction, and if you don't agree, and 1 as if you agree with that transaction. So they run this agreement protocol, and at the end, each party needs to output a specific value. Let's see how we can define security in the context of agreement protocol. To have a secure agreement protocol, a couple of properties should be achieved, and the most important one is the agreement. And by the agreement, I mean that no matter what's the starting input, it is 0 or 1, at the end of the protocol, all the participants should output the same value. It should be either 0 or 1, but it should be a unified value. The second property is validity, which means that if all the honest nodes starts with a specific input, at the end of the protocol, that the output should be equal to that input. So if all the honest players agree that this transaction is valid, at the end of the protocol, the adversary should not be able to change the consensus result. And finally, we have termination. And by termination, I mean that the protocol should not get stuck. No matter some parties are offline, no matter there is a disconnection in the network, they should run the protocol, and eventually they should output a specific value. As distributed system evolved in the past years, you can see that also the terminology that we are using to define the security is also changing to be compatible with the new system. For example, when we had these replicas distributed databases, in order to define security, we use different terminologies such as consistency and availability. I would say, although the terminology is a bit different, but they are almost referring to the same thing. So by consistency, I mean that all the nodes should reflect the same data, and by availability, I mean that the system should be operational. But designing such agreement or consensus protocols are not really trivial. Here I just brought a simple example to see what are the challenges. So assume this very, very simple example. So according to this protocol, at the start of the protocol, each party should broadcast its input to all the other nodes. And after a specific time, they should decide the output based on the majority of the received inputs. So this is a very simple one. It seems logical, but unfortunately, it's not enough to design a secure protocol. Because here we are dealing with a couple of challenges. The first one is that there might exist some adversarial nodes in the network. And the problem with these adversarial nodes is that they can send conflicting data to different honest players, and by doing so, they can break the consistency. The other problem is that typically in this kind of protocols, the underlying network is not really reliable. There might be disconnections, there might be partitioning, and because of this partitioning, again, we can lose consistency. So this can be the case that in the left-hand side, they agree on a different value compared to the right-hand side. So these kind of protocols are really challenging. So for example, if you take a look at the classical consensus protocols, for example, practical BFD, you see that there are different rounds: proposing, pre-committing, committing, you have view change. So these are really complex. I would say it's a total headache. But the reason that these are complex is because of that the underlying conditions are also really complex. Here I just want to review one of the most famous theorems that we have in the distributed systems. It's called CAPS theorem. According to this theorem, we cannot have a distributed system can achieve all these three properties at the same time. So at most, any distributed system can achieve two of that. So the first one is consistency, then we have availability, and third one is the partition tolerance. And this is not really difficult to see. So assume that we have two different nodes in the system, and the goal of this system is just to preserve the same state. For the first scenario, just assume that there is no partitioning in the network. Then whenever a client sends a request to node 2, then node 2 can process this request, can update its state, and also can communicate with node 1 so that node 1 can also update its state. So here we have both availability and consistency. But now assume that the network expects to have some partitioning. Then if the protocol is designed in the way that the node 2 responds to the request of the client, the node 2 should update its state. But because of the partitioning, he cannot communicate with the other node in the other partition. So here we have the availability, but we will lose this consistency because two different nodes in two different partitions have different states. But if the protocol is designed in a way to prefer consistency, then the node 2 is obliged to just reject the request and not provide any response to the request of the client. And again, this slide, I want to analyze the communication models of the consensus mechanism. Typically, to analyze consensus mechanism, we need to have some assumptions about the underlying communication network. Here, I just brought I think the most simple and the most standard way to categorize different communication models. So here I introduced them, and in the later slides, I will use both these communication models and also the CAPS theorem that I introduced in the previous slide. So we have a synchronous network. In the synchronous network, there is a finite known delay bound, which is denoted by delta. And after this delta, any message should be broadcasted to all the other nodes. So assume that I'm a participant in the network, I send a message, and after this delta, in this network, we have this guarantee that all the participants receive the data. Then we have a synchronous network. In this kind of networks, the adversary can delay any message for a very, very long time. The synchronous model is very optimistic because, for example, you can never have this assumption that after 2 seconds, all the messages are delivered to all the parties. But on the other hand, the asynchronous network is very pessimistic. To be a bit more practical, the researchers have also defined this partial synchrony. So in the partial synchrony model, we have a global stabilization time, GST. And after this GST, we are returned to the synchrony. So before GST, we have asynchrony. And after this GST, we are returning to the synchrony. And the most important point is that this GST is set by the adversary. So the adversary can set it to, for example, 1 hour, 2 hour, 1 year. So it's completely under control of the adversary, but there should exist a time for GST. Now, I want to proceed with the blockchains, which provide us with the permissionless consensus mechanisms. But I want to know whether if there is any question or not so far. Okay. So I think the most valuable thing regarding the blockchain is that they have provided us with these permissionless consensus mechanisms. All the classical consensus mechanisms are permissioned, and by permission I mean that they are designed for a group of nodes that first those nodes are identified, and also we know the total number of those nodes. For example, in practical BFD, in order to progress to the next step, you need to wait for 2f plus 1 of the votes. So you need to know what is f, you need to know what is n, otherwise you cannot really use this kind of protocols. This kind of protocol is really suitable to, for example, be implemented among different branches of a bank. So you have different branches, all of them are under control a specific entity, and all of them are certified. Therefore, you can use a permission blockchain here. But the missing piece in this permission style blockchain is the decentralization. And by decentralization, I mean that anyone should be able to participate in the protocols in a meaningful way. Just assume that you have a decentralized banking system that is run by normal people. Anyone can join the system, anyone can leave the system, and this is not problematic for the whole protocol or the whole system. And this is exactly what blockchain can provide us with. I already mentioned that designing consensus mechanism is really challenging. But besides those challenges, for example, the adversarial nodes, the unreliable network, designing permissionless consensus mechanism have another major problem. Because here we are dealing with an unknown set of players of an unknown size. So assume just that there is a presidential election, and I say that one candidate has won 2 million votes. Is he the winner of the election or not? You may answer, so which country you are talking about? And why you are asking this? Because you want to know the total number of voters. The permission blockchains have solved this problem by introducing a specific resource, and they make participation allowed upon controlling that resource. And this is just because to have some estimation of the number of participants so they can define this majority quorum. This resource should have a couple of properties. It should be universally accessible, so everyone should be able to participate in the protocol. It should be scarce. If the resource is not scarce, then in the middle of the protocol, a new player can join the network with an unlimited amount of resource and easily change the result of the consensus mechanism. And also it should be verifiable, meaning that if I claim that I have consumed this amount of resource, it should be verifiable. So if you take a look at all the permissionless consensus mechanism or all the blockchains, you can see that they are following this formula. So there is a proof of X plus some consensus mechanism. And the role of this proof of X is just to make it permissionless. For example, you are familiar with Bitcoin. Bitcoin is based on proof of work. So the resource is the computational power, and in order to participate, you need to prove that you have conducted some computational power. We have also proof of stake protocols, and here the resource is the stake, so you should prove that you have deposited some amount of stake on the chain. And no matter what is the underlying stake, underlying resource, it's computational power or stake, the protocols are designed in a way that the participants' contribution to the protocol is proportional to the amount of resource that they have provided. This contribution can be the number of blocks they propose, the number of votes they propose, but whatever it is proportional to the amount of resource they own. Now let's see how we can really define a secure blockchain protocols. Any secure blockchain protocol should have these two properties, finality and liveness. As you can see, again, we are using different terminology, but the idea is the same. So roughly speaking, finality means that all the nodes should reflect the same ledger or should have the same chain. But let's be a bit more formal and scientific. So assume that CTI represent the finalized chain in the view of honest node I at a specific time t, and CT prime j represents the finalized chain in the view of another honest node in a later time. In order to have finality, we need to have this. So either the first chain should be a subset or should be a prefix of the second chain, or the other way around. And this means that if a block is finalized in the view of one honest chain, sooner or later, that block would be also finalized in the view of another chain. So there is no possibility that the finalized block gets rejected or gets reverted in the future. And also we have liveness. And again, informally speaking, liveness means that if you see a transaction, this transaction should be included in the chain eventually. But to a bit formal, if a specific awake honest node see a transaction at time t, the protocol should define a deterministic time, which is denoted by t confirmation. And after this t confirmation, this transaction should be included in the ledger of all the other honest nodes, all the other awake honest nodes. Similar to the capsarium that we have in the distributed systems, we have capsarium in the blockchain context. But before reviewing capsarium, let's see what we know here based on the previous definitions. So consider two different scenarios. In the first scenario, we have network partitioning. Under this scenario, no protocol can be live. Because if we want the protocol to be live, we need to specify a specific confirmation time that after this, all the nodes have the transaction. But if there is a partitioning, maybe one node is in another partition, and the adversary can set the GST to be very, very long. Therefore, the partitioning will persist, and the other node will not receive the transaction that you have. So we don't have liveness under network partitioning, but we can have some protocols that they can be consistent. Now assume another condition, which is dynamic participation. By dynamic participation, I mean that the nodes can become offline. So here, there is no network partitioning, but we have this assume that the nodes can be offline. Here, we can have liveness, but we don't have consistency. There is no protocol can achieve consistency. The reason is that, so assume that only 10% of the nodes are online. So for sure, you cannot achieve the majority. So we know we have two different kind of protocols. And the nice thing about the capsarium is that we know we have protocols that can be consistent under network partitioning. We know we have some protocols that can be live under dynamic participation, but we cannot have a protocol that achieve both of them at the same time. And the main reason behind this theorem is that the network cannot distinguish whether a specific node is offline or there is a crash in the network. So assume that you are one of the blockchain nodes and you receive a transaction and you want to finalize this transaction. You ask for the opinion of the other nodes. You don't hear anything. If you are pretty sure that they are offline, you can proceed and later you can communicate with them. But this can be the case that those nodes are online, but they are in another partition, so they may be somehow finalize a conflicting transaction. So because of this inherent problem in the networks, we have this capsarium. So the most important takeaway is that for any, thanks to the ChatGPT, it's obvious that it's not from my side. So the protocols are divided into different groups. They either prefer liveness or they prefer finality. Okay, so I mentioned that we have this formula for designing the permissionless consensus mechanism, proof of X plus some consensus mechanism. So here I want to go through a couple of most famous ones. So the first one is proof of work plus longest chain rule. And I'm pretty sure that you know Bitcoin is in this group. We have other protocols such as Dogecoin, Monero. Almost most of the proof of work based protocols are inside this group. So the first question that when you want to analyze a specific protocol that you should ask is that whether this protocol is liveness favoring or finality favoring. And what's your opinion about the longest chain rule? So this one is a live protocol. The reason is that you can never be sure that the block is finalized if you are under partitioning in the network protocol. So assume that we have this longest chain in the Bitcoin protocol, and I'm asking this question from you, that is the latest blockchain in the Bitcoin protocol finalized or not? Is the latest block? You may answer that this block is not, but if you wait a bit more, so this block gets deeper in the blockchain, we can say with a high probability this block is finalized. So this is a very good answer, but you should know that this answer is valid under synchrony. If we are under partial synchrony or asynchrony, no matter how deep the block is, the adversary can decide the GST for a very long time. So we have this partitioning for a very, very long time. And therefore, maybe this can be the case that the majority is in the other partition, and at the end they come up with a longer chain. So your block would be reverted. To be a bit more formal, we can prove that under synchrony, the longest chain rule is proven to be secure, which I mean that is both live and consistent, but based on this important assumption of honest majority. And what is the honest majority in the Bitcoin? 33%, 51%. I hope that you know it's 51%, yeah. But, so it's a bit informal. So if you say 51% is correct, but it's a bit informal, because in the theoretical analysis, we need to bound this majority based on this bound delta. Because this bound delta have a huge impact on the natural orphaning rate. So let me explain what do I mean. So assume that you have these 3 blocks, they are mined in different times. You assume that the interval between the second block and the first block is greater than delta. So we are pretty sure that when the miner of the second block mined this block, he was aware of the first block. So he can mine his block on top of the first block. But now assume that the interval between the second and the third block is less than delta. So right now, the adversary can delay block 2 until the end of delta, so the miner of block 3 is not aware of block 2. So he will propose his block on top of block 1, not block 2. And to this phenomenon, we call it as the natural block orphaning, because here we have 2 forks with the same height, and at the end, only one of these 2 blocks will end up being in the canonical chain. So one of these blocks will become orphan. And by orphan, I mean that these blocks are completely valid. They have a valid nonce, but they remain out of the canonical chain. And this problem refers to one of the most fundamental problems that we have in the blockchain scalability. So right now in the Bitcoin, the block interval is set to be 10 minutes, but why we cannot easily reduce this 10 minutes to a few seconds? The problem is that if you do so because of the delay of broadcasting of these blocks, so the blocks, rather than extending the longest chain, they will end up extending the width of the chain. And whenever they are extending the width of the chain, they are somehow neutralizing the power of each other. So the power of honest miner is reducing, and the adversary with a single private chain can attack this blockchain easily. So when the honest miners have this time to mine on top of each other, so they cannot be defeated by the adversary. But if they blocks are mined in a parallel way, then the adversary can easily defeat them with a single private chain. There is a famous paper published in the CCS 2020. This CCS is one of the most famous security conferences, and this paper is just about proving this bound. So they prove this inequality. They prove that under this inequality, the Bitcoin protocol is secure. So here RA denotes the adversarial mining rate, how many blocks the adversary can mine in a specific period. And RH denotes the honest mining rate, and delta is the network that we have in the synchronous protocols. If this is satisfied, then the Bitcoin protocol under synchrony is secure. Otherwise, a single private adversarial chain can attack the honest chain. So for example, if we assume that the delta is 1 minute, and assume that the adversary controls only 49% of the total mining power share and the honest controls 51%, you can see that the left-hand side is not smaller than the right-hand side, and therefore, under this condition, if delta is 1 minute, then we cannot conclude that the Bitcoin protocol is secure. So this figure represents the maximum adversarial power that the Bitcoin protocol can tolerate as a function of this delta. And as you can see, as delta is increasing, the security threshold of the Bitcoin is decreasing. But what is the correct estimate for the Bitcoin protocol? Before 2016, whenever a miner mined a block, he was supposed to send the full block in the network, the full block of 1 megabyte. And it typically took 1 to 2 minutes to be broadcasted among all the nodes. So we had a higher delta, and we had a substantial amount of orphaning rate between 1 to 3%. But after 2016, they introduced the compact block update. So in this update, they are somehow separating the consensus data from the transaction data. So the majority space of a block is for the transaction data. In this protocol, after applying this update, they pre-broadcast all the transactions in the network. And once a block is mined, they only transfer the header of the block, besides some very, very brief ID to those transactions that are included in this block. So in this way, they just send a few kilobytes of compact block to the other nodes. And because of that, the delta is reduced afterward. And also, the orphaning rate has been reduced substantially. And to wrap up the longest chain rule, so I mentioned that longest chain rule is secure under synchrony, but it's not secure under partial synchrony because the adversary can delay the messages, can delay the blocks as long as he wants. So if you don't have any question, I can proceed with the second group of protocols. Yeah. Yeah. I think you can never have, because then the adversary can. No, it's not exactly the 10 minutes. It depends on your adversarial power. Because, for example, assume that the adversary can mine block every 20 minutes. So if your delta is greater than 20 minutes, then you are pretty sure that the adversary can catch up with this, for example.
So this graph, the 10 minutes delay is kept constant, right? So if we're assuming here the parameter that Bitcoin uses.
So this delta here, this is the delay that this is not exactly the Bitcoin's delay, but we assume if this was the Bitcoin's delay, then this is the security. So for example, before 2006, it was around 120 seconds. So the security was around 47%, something like this. But right now, I would say it's around 50% because the delay is a few seconds. We just need to send the compact block in the network.
Yeah, so there is like what you're referring to here, the delta is the time it takes for a newly found block to propagate.
Exactly.
The majority of the node, or like
Because typically in the theoretical papers, when they assume the adversary, they assume the most powerful adversary. So the adversary can delay any message up to delta. So it's not like that we say, oh, for 30% is delta, or for example, for 70%. Yeah. So we consider the worst case scenario.
So you sort of assume, okay, after delta, I can.
Yeah. So if two blocks are mined in a shorter time of delta, then for sure they are going to orphan each other.
So even with the or deltas. Bitcoin's mining protocol, because of the difficulty, will require that the blocks are on average spaced 10 minutes apart. Right?
Yeah. But still, there's a possibility that two blocks are mined in a very, very short time beside each other.
So I also mentioned to the students that typically in practice, there's these block confirmations that are sort of correlated with the probability that the block will be final, and there is this typical assumption that 6 block confirmations,
exactly,
about an hour, is typically considered sufficient to consider the transaction final in practice. But so this is of course under the assumption that indeed there is no adversary that can.
Yeah, exactly. So, because you never know, maybe there are some governments that they have this hidden chain. I mean, you never know.
In fact, I do think there are these attacks like eclipse attacks, for instance, where so there is this assumption that in this peer-to-peer network that you are connected to a sufficiently random group of neighbors.
Exactly.
The attacker is unlikely to control all of them.
Yeah. If you can perform the OS attack, then by partitioning the honest miners, you can again cause this kind of orphaning because they don't see each other's block.
Yeah. So that is a very dangerous attack where you can isolate honest nodes by surrounding them with all.
Yeah, exactly.
Or attacker control nodes, and then the honest node thinks it's connected to many honest nodes, but actually it's sort of surrounded by an attacker that isolates them from the real blockchain.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's proceed with the other groups of blockchain protocols. Here we have proof of stake plus longest chain rule. So longest chain rule is not just specific to proof of work protocols. We have some proof of stake based protocols that they are also using longest chain, and Cardano is the most famous one. Here I just need to explain how block proposing works in Cardano, because I need to introduce a couple of attacks and I need this information. So I know that you're familiar with the Bitcoin protocol, but here in the proof of stake protocol, there is no mining, there is no nonsense, so we don't find anything. But let's see how block proposing works in the Cardano. So in order to become a validator in the Cardano, you need to deposit a stake. So you have a specific account, you transfer money to that account, and this account is linked to a key pair. So this account is linked to a public key, and the owner of the account is anyone who owns the corresponding secret key of this public key. So this table represents the stake share of different validators. Assume that we have n validator and the sum of their shares is equal to 1. For block proposing, Cardano is using a verifiable random function. This verifiable random function is just a cryptography function that takes a specific input, applies the secret key, and generates a random output, which is denoted by out I. But why it is called verifiable? Because beside this out I, there is another output, which we call it proof, denoted by pi. So using this proof and also my public key, you can verify that my randomness is really generated based on this protocol. So I assume that I'm a validator, I have a secret key, I generate a randomness using this secret key, and then you can verify using my public key that this randomness is correct or not. So in Cardano, time is divided into 1 second slot, and each slot, each validator run this VRF function on this specific input. The input equals to the slot number concatenated with a specific random seed. This random seed is very important. I will discuss later why. But just assume that there is for each slot, there is an input. You run this VRF function. And if this is the case, that the output of that VRF function is less than a specific target, you are eligible to propose a block in that specific slot. So this is a bit scary, but if you simplify, if R is very small, you can simplify it to this form. So as you can see, this target is proportional to the amount of stake that you deposited. And because of that, the probability that you can propose a block is proportional to the amount of stake that you have proposed in the chain. Again, the first question that we can ask is that whether this protocol is liveness favoring or finality favoring. And because it is using the longest chain rule, it is liveness favoring. And regarding this consensus mechanism, because it's a longest chain rule, almost the same analysis that we have already discussed will apply. So it is secure under synchrony and not secure under partial synchrony. I want to continue with explaining a nice attack, which is called the grinding attack. So the question is that what happens if the VRF input is purely deterministic? If it is deterministic, then the adversary can predict all the outputs in advance because you have the slot numbers, you have the secret key, and you can run this VRF function to know what is the output of this VRF function. Then the adversary can do as follows. So for each slot number, it can grind all through millions of secret keys to finally want the proper secret key that can satisfy this inequality. So no matter how target is small, because the adversary has this opportunity to go through all the secret keys, finally he can find a specific secret key that makes him eligible to propose a block in any specific slot. So this is the grinding attack. And then what can adversary do is that rather than sending a huge capital to a specific account, he can just split that money. He can send his money to lots of accounts, but with a very tiny amount of capital, but select the secret keys of those accounts in a way that he's the proposer in any slot. So just assume that the honest proposers can propose every 20 slot, but the adversary can propose in each slot. The adversary can easily, perform the private chain attack to this kind of protocols. So how do they prevent this kind of attacks? They are using some random seed in the VRF. So the attacker cannot do this grinding attack in advance because some part of this input is a random number. But how we can really generate a random number in the blockchain? If we want to be completely random, we need to trust on a specific third party, which is not really proper for the blockchain protocols. So rather than using a completely random, we are using a pseudo-random, and this pseudo-random is extracted from the blockchain information. So it's almost like this, that for example, for the newest slot, if we want to run the VRF function, this VRF function should be run on a specific random, which is extracted from a block beforehand. And the most important thing is that the account information that is used for this block should come from a block that is even earlier from the random seed. Because if this was not the case, the adversary can still do the grinding attack. Because after the block that provides the random seed, the output of the VR is completely deterministic. So the adversary can do this grinding attack. So the other attack that I'm going to discuss, and I think was one of the most threatening attacks to the proof of stake protocol, is not specific to the longest chain protocols. And even the previous attack was not really specific to longest chain protocol. It can be applied to all the proof of stake protocols. So it's called long range attacks. So in this attack, the adversary generates a very, very deep fork. So it starts from the genesis block, from the first block in the chain. It creates a private hidden chain. Whenever there is an honest slot in that private chain, the adversary doesn't have the secret key, so he cannot create a block. But whenever there is an adversarial slot, he can create a block. So we can see that at the beginning, the probability of proposing blocks in both of these two chains are the same for the adversary. But very important fact is that the adversary is the only validator in the second chain. And typically, all of these permissionless protocols, they have a reward mechanism. So if you participate as a validator in the protocol, you can earn some rewards. And because the adversary is the only validator in the private chain, he can gradually accumulate all those rewards. And therefore, after a while, he becomes a very, very powerful staker in that specific chain. So we can see that after a while, in almost any slot, the adversary can propose the block in the adversarial chain. So for example, he owns 90% of the stakes in the adversarial chain. And then if he stops proposing blocks in the public chain, we will reach to a moment that the adversarial header chain is longer than the public chain. And at that moment, the adversary can reveal his secret chain and overwrite the blockchain history. So this is a very serious attack. And if you have the code, you can easily, in few seconds, run your private chain and create your private chain, because you can easily forge all the timestamps, all the data, and you can create your private chain. But this attack is not possible in proof of work, because in the proof of work, for mining a valid block, you need to do some computational effort. But here, you do nothing. It's just a signature, and in just milliseconds, you can perform that signature. So what are the countermeasures against this attack? So Cardano is using these max rollback depths. So they have announced a specific K, which is, I think, around 2000. And they say that if the fork length is less than this K, you should go with the longest chain rule. But if the divergence place is deeper than this K, you should just ignore the longest chain rule. So even if you hear a longer chain, you should not adopt that. You should just discard that one. So this is a nice idea, but unfortunately, it doesn't really work for the new joiners, because this countermeasure is suitable for an online participant who already have the chain. If you are a new joiner, you receive a couple of chains, and typically you should go for the longer, and you don't know whether this longer is for the adversary or not. The other countermeasure is just to go for the denser chain. Because at the beginning of this attack, the adversarial chain is quite empty, so you can go for the denser chain. That's a nice approach, but still it's susceptible to different kinds of attacks. For example, if the adversary performed the OS attack on the public chain, it can also reduce density in the public chain. Or another simple, but I think very, very dangerous attack is that the distribution of stakers will evolve in the time. So for example, it can be the case that in 2016, there was a validator, but right now this validator is not validator anymore. So he has taken out all of his money from the chain. So in this case, you can easily ask him to give you his secret key, because he doesn't care anything. He doesn't care anymore about the chain, so he can reveal the secret key. And now you have those secret keys, and you can easily create this chain. But the most practical approach that they are using in both Cardano and also the Ethereum is just this weak subjectivity. So whenever for the first time you're joining the network, you should get connected to the trusted source and get the latest checkpoint from that source. So it's called weak subject. So in the Bitcoin, it's completely objective. You download the chain, you can verify whether it's the longest chain or not. But here you need some sort of trust. You need to trust on the other people's opinion. Because of that, it's called weak subjectivity. And so if you don't have any question, I can continue. Okay, yeah, go ahead. So, yeah. So it's completely possible that the latest K block can be reverted because it's the longest chain, but you cannot perform this easy longest chain attack because for this, the previous attack, I forgot the name, the long range attack. The reason is that for accumulating the reward, you need lots of blocks, and this 2000 block is not enough for doing that. So if you want to this reorg attack that is length is less than 2000 block, you, for example, you should have a substantial amount of staking power to be able to do so. Yeah. Yes.
For the rollback solution.
Okay. Yeah. So. Yeah. That's really problematic. Yeah. This is the main problem of the longest chain protocols. And typically, I think in the worst case scenario, you should trust on some specific entity that is announced with the Cardano, that is related to the Cardano protocol. So they would say you should trust, for example, on this entity. I think this is the most practical solution.
So you mentioned that Cardano uses weak subjectivity, but also Ethereum, but I thought Ethereum falls more in this category of the voting, at least the
Yeah, but I think this attack is not only specific to the longest chain rules. It can be applied to all the proof of stake protocols. And the main reason is that in proof of stake protocols, proposing block is very cheap. So assume that, for example, you collude with the Ethereum participants from the beginning and you have their secret keys. Assume that we are in the post-quantum era. We can break easily those secret keys. So you can, in 1 second, you can create your own chain. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, exactly. Okay, so the final group of protocols that I'm going to review is proof of stake plus voting-based rule. Ethereum, Algorand are those protocols that are in these groups. I just want to focus on the Ethereum protocol. I know that you're familiar with the Casper FFG in this course, but here is just a brief overview of the Casper FFG protocol. So in Ethereum, the epochs are divided into 32 slots. Each epoch has a checkpoint block, and the goal of this FFG is just to finalize that checkpoint. And once the checkpoint is finalized, all the previous blocks would get finalized also. So in order to finalize block 2, during epoch n-1, you need to submit target vote on top of this block 2. And at the end of this epoch, once you receive all the majority, the block becomes justified. So at the end of this epoch, you reach to this statement that I know that the majority agrees with this block. But this statement is not enough for the consensus mechanism. You need a second round of voting, and in this and the epoch end, the participants propose source votes on top of block 2, and after this second round of voting, block 2 becomes finalized. And after this epoch, you reach to this statement that I know that the majority knows that the majority agree with this block. And this is something that you need for the consensus mechanism. And it's pretty similar to those classical consensus mechanisms. We always have these rounds: proposing, pre-committing, committing. And so according to the CAP theorem categorization, the FFG protocol prefers finality. It's not a live protocol. It's obvious because in the FFG, you need 2/3 of the votes to justify a block. And if, for example, 40% of the participants are offline, then you can never finalize a specific block. And if we want to a bit more formal, we can prove that under partial synchrony, BFDS-style protocols such as Casper FFG are consistent based on a specific assumption of honest majority. So in the Bitcoin, we have this majority assumption, but here we have this super majority assumption. So typically you need 2/3 of the votes, 2/3 of the participants to be honest. But let's see why this is the case, why the most number of adversary that the system can tolerate is equal to 1/3. Typically, if you want to, in the theoretical papers, if you want to bound this kind of information, you should always think about the worst attack that the adversary can apply. So what is the optimal attack that the adversary can apply? Because these protocols are designed to work under partitioning, the adversary can use this partitioning. So he creates two different partitions, and the goal of the adversary is just to divide different players into different partitions and finalize two different blocks in these two different partitions. In order to prevent this, so what can adversary do regarding the splitting the honest parties? The most optimum thing that the adversary can do is just to split the honest parties into different parts. And he can simultaneously participate in both of these partitions. In order to prevent this attack, we need that the total number of participants in any of these partitions should be less than the size of the core. So if you just simplify this inequality, you will reach to the right-hand side inequality. And also we have a liveness condition. So the size of quorum should always be less than the number of honest participants. Because if this is not the case, the adversary can stay to always be silent and therefore prevent any block finalization. And by simplifying these conditions, you will reach to this conclusion that the number of honest should be bigger than the 2/3 of the total number of participants, and the adversary should be less than 1/3.
Just to clarify to the students, because last week we talked about the flow, but so you're referring to the A here is like the F in my
yeah, exactly. Typically they did not.
N equals 3F plus 1, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so the honest nodes is just the or F equals,
Yeah, typically H is said to be 2F plus 1, and N is equal to 3F plus 1.
We're talking about the same.
Yeah, exactly the same.
As what we discussed last.
Okay, so we know that Ethereum is equipped with this Casper FFG protocol, but the Casper FFG protocol is not live. But how Ethereum can achieve liveness? This is a very important question, because you cannot design a protocol that is not live. Because, for example, just assume that the user says, I have a transaction, but you say, okay, I cannot handle this transaction right now. Please wait 2 hours later, and maybe then I can do something. So this is not a really proper design. And because of that, Ethereum has also equipped to another protocol, which is called LMD Ghost. And this LMD Ghost is responsible to bring liveness to the protocol. So the LMD Ghost is similar to the longest chain in Bitcoin. It's responsible to select the head of the blockchain. So it will help the next proposer to select which chain is the best, so he can propose his block on top of that chain. So in each round of voting in Ethereum, the validator submits an attestation, and this attestation includes 3 different votes. The source vote and the target vote are for the Casper FFG that you are familiar with, and then we have this head vote, which is for the LMD Ghost. So LMD Ghost is a voting-based rule. It doesn't use the longest chain rule anymore. It prefers the heaviest chain, and for helping the proposers to select the heavier chain, all the participants vote. And using these votes, the proposer can select the heaviest chain. So LMD Ghost stands for latest message driven greedy AVS, observe sub 3. It's very scary, but it's quite simple. Let's see how it works. So assume that this is the fork in the network, and we want to select which one is the best chain. If we were using the longest chain, B6 was the best chain. It was obvious. But here in the LMD Ghost, we are using the weight that is achieved based on the number of votes. So assume that this number represents the number of votes that are available for each block. And for each validator, we only consider the latest vote. And because of that, it is called latest message driven. Then from the last justified block, or where the fork has emerged, you calculate the weight of any forks routing from that block. So the weight of a fork is equal to sum of the weight of all the blocks in that fork. So for the upper fork, the weight is equal to 800, and for the lower fork is 300. Therefore, the lower fork is the weaker fork and is eliminated. And in the upper fork, we can proceed to the B1 because there is no forking. And between B2 and B3, we will choose B3. Yeah, because it has the higher number of votes. So B3, according to the LMD ghost, is the best chain. And the proposer of the next slot will propose his block on top of the block B3.
So the numbers here represent the total stake of all of the voters that voted for that block?
Yeah, exactly. So it's equivalent to this thing.
So you look at every block has like signatures from the voters.
Yeah.
For every one of those voters, how much stake they have.
Yeah, exactly.
That number is the sum of that.
So yeah, if your stake is twice as mine, you have 2 votes, I have 1 vote, something like this. So how I can design? Yes. Yeah, we go for the B2 chain then because it's heavier. Yeah. So in the longest chain, we start from the tip of the chain, but for the LMD ghost, we need to start from the genesis to last justified block and proceed to find the. Yeah, exactly, the blocks that are coming afterwards. Exactly. So how we can design a secure protocol in this kind of for example, in Ethereum, because we know that Casper FFG is a finalized preferring protocol and LMD Ghost is a liveness preferring protocol. How we can combine this? A very common approach to design a secure blockchain using these methods is just so we use a specific fork choice rule. For example, Ethereum is LMD Ghost, which is responsible for outputting the live ledger. And we use another protocol which is responsible for outputting the finalized ledger, which is Casper FFG. And then the finalized ledger is always a prefix of a live ledger. So assume that this is the chain, and the upper chain is the live ledger, and we would have something like this. So the finalized ledger is always the prefix of the live ledger. And if a block is in a finalized ledger, you have this guarantee that it cannot be reverted. But if it is in a live ledger, so it has this potential to become finalized, but you cannot be 100% sure. Okay, I'm running a bit short. I don't know whether I should proceed with the incentive mechanisms or... Okay, yeah. Okay, so a very fundamental part of any blockchain protocol is the incentive mechanism, because blockchain protocols are run with some random people, and in order to somehow motivate them to participate in this protocol, you need to somehow incentivize them, and this is achieved through this incentive mechanism. So you can consider it as a reward mechanism. So every protocol has a reward mechanism, and if you participate in that protocol, you will earn some cryptocurrency or some rewards. And it turns out that these incentive mechanisms play a very important role for the security of blockchain, because typically when you analyze these security protocols, all the analyses are based on these assumptions that the honest nodes will follow the protocol. But why we should have this assumption? And if you design the protocol in a way that there is an improper design of incentive mechanism, because these nodes are all rational, they prefer to deviate from the honest protocol to earn more. So it's very important to design a proper incentive mechanism for your blockchain. Otherwise, the protocols cannot be secure. And one of the key features of a proper design of an incentive mechanism is to achieve fairness. And by fairness, I mean that the total reward that the participant receives should be proportional to the total amount of resources he has contributed to the chain. So let's analyze Bitcoin fairness. So what is the honest behavior in the Bitcoin? In the Bitcoin, you need to always mine on top of the longest chain, and whenever you mine a block, you should publish this block immediately to all the other participants. So there was a belief that following this honest strategy is the most profitable strategy, but it turns out that this is not really true. Because it is susceptible to the selfish mining attack. Let me introduce this attack. Assume that the block B0 is the tip of the longest chain. The adversary, assume this scenario that the adversary has mined a couple of blocks, but rather than publishing those blocks, she decides to keep these blocks secret. Because these blocks are secret, the other honest nodes are not aware of this block, so they may continue mining on top of the previous public block, which is B0, and just assume that they have mined 2 blocks. Now, if the adversary reveals her secret block, because the adversarial chain is the longer, the adversarial chain would win this fork race, and therefore the adversarial blocks will be part of the canonical chain. As a result of this attack, the adversary will earn all the rewards, but the other players will receive no reward. And you can see that this protocol is not really fair. And to analyze the profitability of selfish mining, we should be careful about this point, that selfish mining is a risky attack. So the adversary doesn't always have this guarantee to win the attack. So assume just the adversary starts this attack, mine a block, and keeps that block secret. But if she's unlucky, then it can be the case that the honest miners can mine the longest chain. So in this scenario, the adversary will lose the fork race. So you need some analysis, and it turns out that for having a profitable selfish mining, you need to have 25% of the total mining power. And also, there is one important point, that selfish mining doesn't become immediately profitable. And the reason is that if you take a look at the selfish mining, it's like that, just assume that I have 100 coins and you also have 100 coins. In the selfish mining, I'm not increasing my coin, I'm burning your coin. So it doesn't mean that I'm increasing my reward. But how it can be profitable for the adversary? Bitcoin is equipped with this difficulty adjustment mechanism, which balances the difficulty of Bitcoin mining based on the effective hash power available in the network. And if the adversary starts to perform this attack, some of the blocks will become orphaned. And as a result of this orphaning, the difficulty adjustment will reduce the mining difficulty. And starting from the next epoch, the adversary can mine faster and they can earn more. So then he can convert his 100 coins to 150, something like this. So just, and because the difficulty adjustment are typically applied 2 weeks to the Bitcoin network, so it takes a couple of weeks for this attack to become profitable. So just 2 important points, the adversary needs to own 25%, and it takes a couple of weeks for this attack to become profitable. I wanted to also talk about one of the researches that we have conducted in COSIC. So I try to be very quick about this paper. So in this paper, we also analyzed selfish mining, but by considering the future changes that will apply to the dynamic of Bitcoin reward mechanism. And we showed that in the near future, this attack can become very threatening. In Bitcoin, we have 2 sources of rewards. One is the block subsidy. So whenever you mine a block, the protocol will give you some rewards. And also we have these transaction fees. For any transaction that you include in the Bitcoin block, you will receive a transaction fee. Bitcoin is equipped with this halving mechanism, and every 4 years, the block subsidy is reducing. So at the beginning, it was 50 BTC per block. Right now, it is 3.125 BTC per block. And this halving will continue, and finally, it will converge to 0. So in the early years of the Bitcoin, the Bitcoin subsidy was much, much higher than the transaction fee. So you could assume that all the blocks have you could just easily ignore the transaction fee and assume all the blocks have the same block reward of 50 BTC. And most of the security analyses have been conducted in this setting. But in the near future, transaction fees can be comparable because of this halving with the block reward, with the block subsidy. Or even in the near future, we will have those days that transaction fee is the sole source of reward. In this scenario, we cannot really use the fixed block reward model. And the reason is that in the Bitcoin, different blocks have different block generation times. Although the average is 10 minutes, but some blocks can be mined after 1 minute, some blocks can be mined after 20 minutes. And if it takes a very long time for a block to be mined, then a new set of transactions would be included in the mempool, and this would intensify the competitions with the transactions. So they will offer a higher transaction fee, and therefore the blocks who has a longer generation time will typically have a higher reward. So this picture represents the transaction fee per block as a block generation time for 2 different days. And you can see this pattern that whenever the block generation time increases, the transaction fee per reward also increases. So this shows that in the near future, we will have volatility in the block reward. And because of this volatility, we need to revisit the security analysis conducted in the Bitcoin. For example, in the fixed block reward model, we can prove that the best strategy for every miner is just to mine on top of the longest chain. But this is not true in the near future anymore. The reason is that assume that we have this block B0, and with respect to this block B0, the mempool is quite full. And now assume that the next block is mined on top of block B0, and this block has consumed almost all the transaction in the mempool. So then the mempool becomes empty. Now the miners have 2 options. They can either continue mining on top of block B1, but if they mine a block, the potential block would have a very low transaction fee. Or they have the other option. They can mine on top of block B0 with a very full mempool. Now if they mine a block, this block would have a high transaction fee reward, but this block is subject to a fork race with block B1. So maybe it will lose or maybe it will win. So there is a dilemma here. Which one is more profitable depends on the statistics of the mempool, but it turns out for some scenarios, the second option is more profitable. So in the near future, we cannot say that mining on top of the blocks or all on top of the chain is always profitable. So just assume that you mine a block with a very tiny reward. You don't have anything to lose. There is no need to make this block public. You can just make it hidden to perform selfish mining or other adversarial strategies. So I want just to share some results with you. So this graph represents the security threshold of Bitcoin over the future years. Just focus on the blue graph. It represents to an adversary with normal communication capability. Right now, the Bitcoin security is 51%, but we showed that once the block reward converges to 0, this security threshold will reduce to 16%. And this 16% is in the range of some of the mining pools that right now we have. So we have 2 mining pools right now whose mining share is greater than this 16%. So in the near future, if we want to continue with this reward mechanism, there would be lots of important threats for the Bitcoin network. So we also, in this paper, implement reinforcement learning tools. So we implement the Bitcoin environment inside this tool, and it's capable of analyzing Bitcoin under any specific mempool condition. So this graph, again, represents the percentage increase in the adversary for the adversary as a function of, it's not important because I didn't explain, but the most important thing is that assume that the orange one corresponds to the mempool. With a congested mempool, you have lots of good transactions in the mempool, and the red bar corresponds to the empty mempool. And as you can see, whenever the mempool is empty, this kind of attacks become more profitable. So the adversary is more incentivized to deviate from the honest strategy. So I think this was the most important takeaway. And just the petty compliant miners also refer to the rationals miner that exists in the network. Because in a more practical classification, we can have honest players, rational players, and also adversarial players. And as the concluding remark, so I want to share with you that if you are interested in this kind of research that's related to the blockchain in COSIC, we are doing lots of similar research, so just feel free to reach out to me or Bart Brenny. We would be really happy. There are also some summer internship projects. You can visit this website. Right now, there are some projects. They are not really related to the blockchain right now, but I think next week we will release some projects that are also related to the blockchain. You can visit this website, and if you are interested in these internship projects, you can also apply for them. But anyway, if you're interested in doing some research, just feel free to reach out to us. And yeah, thanks a lot.